This is the second in a series of videos outlining the proposals called for in Project 2025. This video focuses on the proposed actions that affect our rights and freedoms beyond those specifically guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, and addresses actions that affect what I am going to classify as our quality of life. Points on the slides include references to applicable pages within the Project 2025 mandate. Part 1 of the series compares Project 2025 proposals to key components of the Constitution and addresses conflicts between the two. I hope you will find time to watch that if you haven't already done so. In Part 1 of the series, I present some statements from Project 2025 that give the listener a sense of the mandate's goals as they relate to the structure and operations of our government. In this part, Part 2, I want to present a few statements from the mandate that will give you a sense of the author's goals as they relate to policies that affect our quality of life. These statements point to the motivating factors behind the actions called for in Project 2025. This book, this agenda, the entire Project 2025 is a plan to unite the conservative movement and the American people against elite rule and woke culture warriors. The next conservative president must make the institutions of American civil society hard targets for woke culture warriors. This starts with deleting the terms sexual orientation and gender identity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, gender equality, gender equity, gender awareness, gender sensitive, abortion, reproductive health, reproductive rights, and any other term used to deprive Americans of their First Amendment rights out of every federal rule, agency regulation, contract, grant, regulation, and piece of legislation that exists. These two statements show the author's disdain for the Democratic Party and its messaging. Project 2025 is a revolt against what the authors refer to as woke cultures. Very early into the current administration, actions were taken to delete certain terminology from documents, remove books from libraries, and threaten institutions whose policies included DEI initiatives. In Part 1 of the series, threats to withhold funding from institutions engaged in DEI initiatives are discussed. When the founders spoke of pursuit of happiness, what they meant might be understood today as, in essence, pursuit of blessedness. That is, an individual must be free to live as his Creator ordained to flourish. Our Constitution grants each of us the liberty to do not what we want, but what we ought. This statement appears to threaten the independence of church and state and leads to the question, who is deciding what we ought to do? The influence of Christian nationalism will become evident as we go through specific Project 2025 policy proposals in this presentation. No other initiative is as important for the Department of the Interior than the restoration of the department's historical role managing the nation's vast storehouse of hydrocarbons, much of which is yet to be discovered. This last statement reflects the goal to promote oil, natural gas, and coal production. In other words, the drill, baby, drill agenda. As we go through, you will see that the goal is at the expense of climate change initiatives. I want to start the presentation on the policies of Project 2025 with the mandate's position on families. You will see I have an image of all types of families here, including families with a single parent, parents of the same sex, and parents consisting of a mother and father. Project 2025 states that family is the centerpiece of American life and is a priority in setting policies. But Project 2025 defines a family exclusively as a married man and woman with children. That eliminates 4 of the 5 images that I have depicted on this slide. The mandate also allows for adoption discrimination. It basically says adoption agencies can require that a child be placed only with a married mother and father. Some states currently allow faith-based adoption agencies to discriminate against gay couples. My understanding is that those agencies must provide some proof that they are religious organizations in order to obtain that exemption. Project 2025 proposes allowing these waivers at a federal level and also seems to propose allowing anyone to obtain a waiver. It specifically states that the Department of Health and Human Services should rescind subjective case-by-case evaluations for religious and faith-based organizations that request religious exemptions, and that the recommended waivers should be granted to all states and agencies that request them. This seems to indicate the validation of the legitimacy of the religious nature of the organization may no longer be required, and almost anyone could get an exemption. Finally, Project 2025 states that every threat to family stability must be confronted. What does that mean? Does that mean same-sex marriage will be banned? Does that mean getting a divorce will become harder? We really don't know. Basing policies on a limited definition of family could result in discrimination in all kinds of areas. Perhaps work benefits or overtime rules could be impacted. We really don't know. Project 2025 also has a patriarchal view of the roles of the married man and woman who they expect to lead the family. The father is considered the breadwinner, the financial provider, and the one who provides play and protection. The mother's role is to provide love and nurturing. The mandate also reveals its goal that mothers stay at home. It encourages providing some funding to offset the cost of mothers staying home rather than funding daycare programs. There are a lot of proposals within Project 2025 that attack reproductive freedoms. Several have already been implemented. The impact of Christian nationalism is evident. Project 2025 defunds Planned Parenthood. This defunding has occurred and is part of the One Big Beautiful Bill, which essentially bans Medicaid payments to providers who offer abortion services. Note that this is not just a ban on payment for abortion services, but is a ban on payments for any services provided by that organization. The mandate also proposes banning chemical abortion drugs. A bill calling for this ban was introduced in March of 2026. Project 2025 also seeks to withdraw the pharmacy abortion mandate. That mandate requires retail pharmacies to carry first trimester abortion drugs. That rule was reversed in January of 2026. In other words, this has also been implemented. The mandate also prohibits abortion travel funding. Abortion travel funding allows federal funds to be used to help with travel for out-of-state abortions. This became necessary after Roe v. Wade was overturned and states began to initiate laws prohibiting abortion. Project 2025 also ends the use of public funds to facilitate abortions for military service members and veterans. This is another action that has been implemented. The above all deals with abortion rights. However, Project 2025 also has policy proposals that affect contraceptive service availability. It eliminates contraceptive services from the Affordable Care Act mandates. There are certain things that are covered now that would no longer be required to be covered, such as condoms and the week after pill. They are also allowing contraceptive services to be excluded from coverage based on a moral exemption. The mandate also calls for states to report data on abortions. We can only surmise why this is being required. However, one component of Project 2025, which was presented in Part 1 of this series, calls for funding based on political loyalty. So reporting information on abortions could be a means of identifying states to punish and to withhold funding from. Project 2025 also eliminates the Health and Human Services Reproductive Health Care Access Task Force and replaces it with a pro-life task force. Again, the impact of Christian nationalism is evident. Within Project 2025, what you will see with regards to the LGBTQ+ community is the deterioration of protections from discrimination. These policies are further evidence of the influence those who believe in Christian nationalism had on the development of Project 2025. The areas where discrimination protections for LGBTQ+ citizens are threatened include in adoption, as noted previously. Project 2025 also attacks LGBTQ+ rights in healthcare. It removes gender identity and sexual orientation from non-discrimination provisions of the Affordable Care Act and all Health and Human Services and Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services programs. The mandate allows practitioners to participate in federal health care programs without being compelled to provide services to this population. While the document specifically highlights gender reassignment surgery in its discussions, removing these protections appears to allow healthcare providers to refuse to provide care to anyone who identifies as LGBTQ+. Project 2025 also assaults the LGBTQ+ community in the military. It calls for the expulsion of troops with gender dysphoria. This has already been implemented. I believe there are lawsuits that have been filed to fight this action. It discriminates in the entrance to military service for those who are predisposed to require medical treatment. I mention that here because the mandate specifically cites being HIV positive as a condition for exclusion. It also rescinds gender reassignment surgery from veterans' health programs. As discussed in a prior slide, Project 2025 authors exclude LGBTQ+ families in their definition of a family. The mandate also seeks to eliminate LGBTQ+ discrimination protections in schools. Title IX, a law enacted in 1972, prohibits sex-based discrimination in any school that receives federal funding. In April of 2024, rules were updated to clarify that sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics were covered under its protections. Project 2025 authors, however, call for limiting the definition of sex under Title IX to be biological sex, thereby removing these protections. A similar effort is called for as it relates to discrimination in the workplace. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibits employment discrimination based on race, religion, sex, and national origin. In 2020, the Supreme Court held that Title VII protections against sex discrimination applied to transgender employees, and that discrimination based on sexual orientation was unlawful. As with the proposals relating to schools, Project 2025 authors want to limit the definition of sex to biological sex, thereby removing these protections within the workplace. Executive Order 14168, mandating this restrictive definition, was one of the first executive orders that Trump implemented. It was signed on the day that he took office. Finally, Project 2025 proposes allowing religious employers the right to ignore non-discrimination laws in their workplace. It appears to allow any organization meeting the Title VII religious exemption to discriminate at will. Project 2025 proposals undermine equality in other areas as well, in other words, not specifically to LGBTQ+ Americans. It eliminates DEI initiatives. I think we are all aware of that, as that started very early on after this administration took office, so I'm not going to get into the details. The mandate also calls for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to disclaim its regulatory pretenses and to reorient enforcement priorities. According to the EEOC website, the EEOC investigates complaints of job discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, age, or genetic information, and is clear that sex discrimination includes pregnancy, transgender status, and sexual orientation. So all of those areas are covered in terms of the types of complaints that the EEOC will investigate. Project 2025 authors, however, call for the EEOC to focus on 3 types of cases: those involving discrimination as a result of disability, religion, and pregnancy, and it specifically mentions that it excludes abortion. That exclusion seems to allow discrimination if the discrimination is based on someone having had an abortion. As a result of this limited focus, efforts to address discrimination against groups such as people of color, women, and LGBTQ+, etc., will be reduced or eliminated under the Project 2025 mandate. The mandate also calls for the elimination of disparate impact as a valid theory of discrimination. Disparate impact applies when a neutral policy disproportionately affects a particular protected group. For example, having strength requirements disproportionately excludes women, older workers, and the disabled, and affected groups could file a claim against the company under the disparate impact theory. As called for in Project 2025, the current administration has eliminated disparate impact as a basis for discrimination claim investigations. These are some headlines that evidence Project 2025's influence on policies of the current administration relative to the EEOC. Finally, Project 2025 proposes eliminating other programs that are designed to further equity, and these are just a few examples cited in the document. Regarding border control, many of the policies called for in Project 2025 have been implemented. These include military at the border, re-implementation of the Remain in Mexico policy, targeting of sanctuary cities, and rescission of sensitive zones, which prevented ICE from operating in schools, churches, and hospitals. Project 2025 also calls for allowing the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security to make rules prohibiting persons from certain places from entering the United States if they anticipate that a large group from that area will be attempting to enter the country. Project 2025 also has policy provisions relating to the eligibility and employment of immigrants. It proposes a merit-based immigration system. This contrasts with what we currently have, which is a system that favors extended family, and also one that allows for a lottery-type luck-of-the-draw selection process. Under a merit-based system, the credentials or backgrounds of those seeking entry to the United States would be the determining factors regarding eligibility. Project 2025 authors propose repealing temporary protected status designations. TPS is granted to nationals of designated countries facing war, disaster, or other extraordinary conditions, making it difficult for them to return home. Many of those in the United States under TPS have been living and working in the U.S. for decades. One concern is that repealing this status may put migrants in danger. The mandate also proposes raising the standard for credible fear of persecution and eliminating certain qualifications from asylum standards. The standard for credible fear of persecution is used to ensure that immigrants who have a significant possibility of being eligible for asylum are not ordered removed through the expedited removal process. The standard differs from asylum eligibility, which has mandatory bars for qualification and requires more evidence of the risk of persecution. Asylum, however, can take months and even years. The risk of raising the standard for credible fear of persecution, I believe, is obvious, that it would result in the death or injury to the person seeking safe haven in the United States. Regarding the asylum standards, the basis for granting asylum currently includes gang violence and domestic violence. Under Project 2025's proposals, being a victim of gang violence or domestic violence may no longer qualify a person for asylum. In terms of employment, the mandate seeks to encourage companies to employ U.S. citizens over immigrants. First, the mandate proposes that at least 70% of the employees of a company that wants to enter into contracts with the federal government must be U.S. citizens, with that percentage increasing to 95% over a 10-year period. Project 2025 also proposes allowing employers to prioritize hiring of U.S. citizens over work-authorized immigrants, which is currently illegal under existing anti-discrimination laws. In terms of the environment, the authors of Project 2025 indicate the goal is to achieve energy dominance, to ensure the security and reliability of energy grids and abundant, affordable energy. This sounds great. However, let's look at some specifics. The mandate withdraws from climate change agreements and repeals climate change initiatives. It promotes investment in oil and gas. This is the drill, baby drill agenda, and it does this by proposing a rollback of regulations that restrict fossil fuel production and by encouraging drilling on public lands, among other things. The mandate also calls for withdrawal from the 30 by 30 executive order and the America the Beautiful initiative. These were plans to conserve 30% of the nation's land and water by 2030. To get those drills going, it proposes actions to expedite leasing of federal land and seas to extractive industries. It proposes allowing the Department of the Interior to delegate the authority to the states to manage federal permitting and regulatory responsibilities for oil and gas development on federal land within their borders. The mandate also eases regulations that prevented new coal, oil, and gas production on federal lands and waters. Examples include removing environmental and climate change mitigation policies, reverting back to earlier National Environmental Policy Act rules, which don't allow consideration of climate impacts in environmental reviews, rescinding the waste prevention rule, which aimed to reduce methane waste associated with oil and gas production, abandoning planned mining and drilling withdrawals, and resuming federal coal leasing, which has been dormant for the past decade. Project 2025 also proposes increasing logging in national forests. It suggests that this is an effort to prevent fires. The mandate also seeks to remove national monument designations and repeal the Antiquities Act. Slashing and repealing these removes protections from key landscapes and basically allows extractive industries to operate in those landscapes. Project 2025 proposes reducing fuel economy levels and calls for ensuring that the Department of Transportation exercises priority in setting the standards rather than the environmental protection agencies. It also revokes waivers that were granted to California. The waivers had allowed California to set more stringent regulations. Project 2025 states, taxpayers should not be picking winners and losers, essentially leaving energy technology development to the private sector. One risk with this policy is that profit will be the motive with no consideration for what is good for the environment or for the impact on our health. It abandons efforts to address climate change and related renewable energy options such as solar and wind. The mandate refers to climate change as a partisan political agenda item. To them, climate change is fake news. The mandate proposes restricting the power of the Endangered Species Act and removing certain species from protection. In April of 2025, a proposal was made to restrict the definition of harm to endangered species to include only actions that directly hurt or kill animals. Currently, the habitats these animals live in are protected. So changing this definition makes it easier to log, mine, and build on lands needed for the survival of these endangered species. Dismantling the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration is another goal of Project 2025. NOAA has several functions, including the National Weather Service, which the mandate proposes privatizing. Project 2025 authors maintain that privatizing will lead to increased efficiency and innovation, something they mentioned throughout the document when suggesting privatizing services. The risks of privatizing, as far as the Weather Service goes, include limitations on public access to critical weather information and warnings, especially for those unable to pay for such services. Reduced data availability and quality, since profits will be the motivating factor. There was also some mention by critics that commercial competition for data could stress the overall forecasting system. NOAA also includes oceanic and atmospheric research. Project 2025 calls for disbanding climate-based research, which is currently part of this division. The mandate also calls for repealing the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. Both of these acts provide subsidies to renewable energy developers, among other things. Finally, Project 2025 proposes eliminating carbon capture, utilization, and storage programs, again suggesting that this be left to the private sector. The goal of these programs is to prevent carbon dioxide, which contributes to climate change, from entering the atmosphere. Whether the private sector will pick this up likely depends on its potential for profits. The mandate also calls for eliminating appliance energy efficiency standards. Two recent developments affecting the environment are the rescission of the finding that greenhouse gases endanger health, which may weaken or eliminate regulations over greenhouse gas emissions, and ending limits on forever chemicals in water. These are a few items that concerned me as I read through Project 2025 that relate to our children and the military. The mandate calls for requiring students in schools that receive federal funding to complete the military entrance exam. Note that this does not apply to private schools or anyone who doesn't receive federal funding. This implies the goal, to me, of having a list of eligible young men most qualified for drafting into the service. Project 2025 also calls for protections for military chaplains. A bill related to this proposal was introduced in May of 2025. A statement by the congressman who introduced that bill gave me pause. He stated, "The military chaplain's ability to freely exercise their religious duty is not only a constitutional right, but it is essential to forming the conscience and character of our war fighters. This seems to allow for religious indoctrination of our troops. Is that not an assault on our religious freedom?" Recent actions by Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, show an effort by the administration to insert religious beliefs into the military. His pastor led a Pentagon prayer service at his request. That pastor believes that the U.S. should adopt a Christian theocracy with laws based on interpretations of the Bible. He maintains that women should not be allowed to vote and that homosexuality should be a crime. Hegseth's pastor is not alone. There are several members of the current administration and of Congress who have been associated with Christian nationalism and its ideals. The rise of Christian nationalism in the United States and its impact are topics deserving of a separate video. For now, I just would like you to consider what life is like in Iran, governed by a supreme leader and a council of clerics, and Afghanistan, ruled by the Taliban. Rights, particularly for women in these theocracies, are severely restricted. Freedom of speech is limited. Same-sex relations are punishable, in some cases by death. Is this the kind of country that you want to live in? If you are concerned about what you have learned from this video, there is another video in this series that suggests actions you can take. A future video will focus on Project 2025's proposals that affect funding of government, taxes, and other topics that could affect you financially. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video.